Hey there, good people of YouTube. I haven't made a video in a while, thought I'd do one today. It's going to be about the omnipotence paradox. I did talk previously in a brief video about omnipotence versus omniscience in God and how that seems to create a problem, and I tried to address that in a... all my videos are kind of haphazard. I don't have a script, I just do it off the cuff. But in this case, the omnipotence paradox, it's one that I've encountered since I was pretty young, and I even attached myself to the argument when I considered myself an atheist. I find it to be extremely pedestrian. The more I study different a different view, I don't like saying a different view or a different concept of God. It's all ultimately talking about the same thing. But let's say the more I study the Vedic concept of God, the more pedestrian the omnipotence paradox seems. On the surface it seems totally airtight, but it doesn't take into account the nature of God in relation to his energies or his power. I guess up front I should say that I'm going to deny the very common Christian apologist concept of ex nihilo, of creation ex nihilo, which is the idea that God creates from nothing. I don't know what that means. I don't know what nothing means. To me it just doesn't. It's stupid. I mean, I don't know what other word to use. It's like saying, when Christians or theists in general will say something doesn't come from nothing, therefore God. Okay, whatever. But then how can you turn around and say on top of that, oh, but God creates from nothing? It's like, well, no, you have God. God is something. And the idea that he creates from nothing is supposed to mean that he doesn't create from any pre-existing material. But I don't see it that way. Or maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but the idea, the understanding that I have is that if you're a being like God, such as God, then you have unlimited potencies. And that potency, or those energies are accompanying you eternally. It's not like God was just some being without power, without potency, and then decided to create the potency. So the potency is already existing. Maybe I'm using the terms incorrectly. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But the way I understand it is potency, energy, same thing in the context of this topic. God has energies, unlimited or inconceivable energies, if you want to say that, if you want to put it that way, and the best analogy that I can give is like the sun globe and the sunshine. The rays of sunshine accompany the sun globe. Applying this analogy to God, the sunshine is his energies and the sun globe is God. And they coexist eternally. They're part of the same being. Yet there's still a relative distinction between them. You can still make this is very much the philosophy in what I aspire toward is called achintya beta beta tattva, which means inconceivably one and distinct, or one and different. So that's, to me, plays a huge part in the omnipotence paradox when I'm looking at the argument, and it says that can God create a rock that's too heavy for him to lift? And obviously if you say he can create it, then you're saying that he's not powerful enough to lift the rock, and if you're saying he can't create it, then you're saying he's not powerful enough to create it. It ultimately boils down to the nature of what is it to create something. If I say that God is creating the rock that is too heavy for him to lift, but that the rock is also God, then where does that leave the argument? What does that put it? Now where's the paradox? God can't lift the rock, but the rock is also God. The rock is God, is an expansion of God's own being. So when the rock can't be lifted, God wins. And when the rock can be lifted, God wins. Well, I don't know why anybody has never thought of, well, maybe they have, I've just never encountered anyone approaching the omnipotence paradox in this way. Even if we take that aside, even if we say, forget about that whole the rock is also God argument, and we just look at it based on the parameters of how it's classically framed. To me, it's just such a you're basically saying, can God do something that contradicts his ability to do all things? It's like, well, obviously, if you're defining omnipotence in such a way that it naturally leads to an absurdity, then it's just a bad term. And then some people go, well, yeah, that's true, then why don't call your God omnipotent? Well, I guess so, or don't define it in such an absurd way. So I don't know. Some people say, is it they'll say, well, God could do anything that's logically possible. I don't even know that I would phrase it that way. That's not important to say whether he can do it logical or illogical. I have no power to see beyond the logic of things. So I mean, I suppose I would just agree with that on its face, but that's not even how I would really approach the argument to try to defeat it. I would just say, it's almost like saying, can God create something that's also totally uncreated and eternal? Well, no. I mean, that's absurd. It doesn't make any sense to even say that. How can you even conceive of such a thing? The nature of creation, or the nature of creating things, is already inferior to something that's eternal. The nature of it is completely inferior. So you're asking, can God create God? Can God create another God, is another way to put it. I don't even know if create's the right word again. If we're talking about, can God be, the whole rock thing, it would have to be in the context of God's expanding and becoming this rock that's too heavy for God to lift. That it's an interplay within God. That God is playing different roles, but both are God. This isn't uncommon. This idea of God having an interplay within himself in different aspects isn't uncommon in Vedic thought, in Toward What I Aspire. They have the Vaishnava view. It's not uncommon. So you get it with different personalities that constitute God. And this is really probably something I shouldn't get into, because it's really it's too much for one video. But just suffice to say that in the Gaudiya Vaishnava, or the Hare Krishna philosophy, God is Krishna, and Krishna also has a person. How do I put it? Krishna also expands into what's the female consort named Radharani, Srimati Radharani. And she is also God. She's also in that God category. There's a distinction between the personalities, but they're both, it's an interplay within God. Now people say, oh, well, God's one. Well, understandably, God is one, but that oneness isn't limited like our oneness. God can expand into different personalities and become. And people, I can already hear, critics or atheists or whoever saying, oh, God has multiple personality disorder, or dissociative personality disorder, whatever you call it. And that's fine if you want to call it that. The difference is that for God, it's not a disorder. It's completely ordered. Anyway, but I digress. So, yeah, I guess that's my take on the omnipotence paradox. Is that it's not a very good argument, except when you're making certain assumptions about the nature of God and his energies, and the nature of what it is to create something, and you're also just playing with words and defining them in absurd ways. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, and that's going to be it for today. And maybe I'll make another video, hopefully I won't take as long as last time. And catch you later.